Hi, I'm David Taub, and welcome to the Parshah Rabbit Hole, where I find something weird in the weekly Torah portion and follow it all the way down until it gets even weirder. This week's rabbit hole starts with the sons of Moshe Rabbeinu, or Moses, and eventually gets us to the philosophy of education, contractual loopholes, and the repercussions of spitting.
Watch out, they spit.
But, as always, we have to get there, so let's get started. This week's Torah portion, Parshas Yisro, contains one of the most important moments in Jewish history, the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. But the Parsha starts out with the story of Moshe Rabbeinu's father-in-law, Yisro, or Jethro, and Moshe's wife Tzipporah and their two sons, Gershom and Eliezer, joining back up with the Israelites after having sat out some of the action.
Here's Jethro.
So even though it might make more sense to focus on the whole Mount Sinai giving of the Torah thing, the way the rabbit hole works is that I follow whatever odd things pique my interest. And in this case, it was the story of this family reunion at the beginning of the Torah portion. We heard about one of the sons back in Parshas Shmos. There was this very strange story that kind of pops up out of the middle of nowhere. Hashem threatens to kill Moshe Rabbeinu until Tzipporah figures out that her son hadn't had a bris yet. So she gives the boy a bris right then and there using a rock. But it actually doesn't say the name of the son there. And because of that, there's actually different opinions in the commentaries as to which one of the two sons it was. At any rate, here in this week's Parsha, the whole family gets back together and we hear about both sons. This is what it says in the Parsha. Ve'es shnei vaneha asher shem ha'echad Gershom, ki amar ger ha'yisi be'eretz nachria. Along with her two sons, the name of one was Gershom, because he said, I was a stranger in a foreign land. V'shem ha'echad Eliezer, ki elikei avi be'ezri, v'yatzileni micherev parei. And the name of one was Eliezer, because the God of my father was my help and rescued me from the sword of Pharaoh. So the names of the two sons are Gershom and Eliezer. Gershom is a combination of the words Ger-shom, stranger there, because Moshe was a stranger in Midian when he was hiding out after he killed the Egyptian back in Mitzrayim, and that's where he went and started his family. The second son is named Eliezer, which means my God helped, acknowledging and thanking Hashem for helping Moshe escape Egypt after he had killed an Egyptian taskmaster. So there are a few interesting things about these names and the verses that tell us about them, and we'll get to some of them along the way. But the thing that really caught my attention is a midrash in Mechilta that involves the whole family. Tzipporah, Moshe, Gershom, Eliezer, Yisro, the whole bunch. This is what it says there. When Moshe asked Yisro for permission to marry his daughter, he agreed on one condition. Your first son will be dedicated to the service of idols, and from here on, they will be for the sake of heaven. Moshe said yes. Yisro said, swear that you'll actually do it, and Moshe took an oath that he would do it. Okay, so this is pretty wild. Yisro made Moshe and Tzipporah make a deal that they would raise their first son as an idol worshiper, and then the rest of them could be raised as Jewish monotheists.
Good evening, pagans. Don't forget your goat leggings.
It kind of makes sense because we do know that Yisro was a Kohen Midian, the priest of Midianite idolatry. But he actually gave up idolatry and switched to our side. When he arrives in the desert and meets up with Moshe, this is what it says. Ata yadaiti, now I know that Hashem is greater than all the other gods. We'll get to a possible answer to that question later, but what most commentaries focus on is a more glaring problem. How could Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, have agreed to such a deal? Ibn Ezra deals with this by rejecting the Midrash completely. He's commenting on the bris story I mentioned earlier, and he references this Midrash, but some of the details are a little bit different. But it seems to me, based on other places that quote this Ibn Ezra, that it is talking about the same Midrash, even though some of the details are different. This is what he says. God forbid you should believe such a thing, that Moshe Rabbeinu agreed with Tzipporah that the first son would belong to him and have a bris, and the second son would be hers and not have a bris. And he adds that this idea comes from Divrei Yachid, a lone opinion in the Midrash. Okay, so there's a few interesting things here. First of all, like I said, some of the details are different. For example, he ascribes the deal to Tzipporah instead of her father, Yisro. He also switches sons, but that's probably because there's different opinions as to which son this was in that story that hadn't had a bris yet. He also shifts the focus of the deal to whether or not the child would have a bris rather than idolatry. But it makes sense that not having a bris would be part of the idolatry deal, and that's the way that Midrash is presented in other sources as well. But the most interesting thing to me about this is that it seems like part of his reasoning for rejecting this Midrash is because it's a minority opinion. This is a fundamental principle in halacha. It comes up all the time, all over the place. There's tons of instances in Gemara, in the Talmud, where one rabbi says an opinion and all the other rabbis disagree with him, and the halacha, the ruling, is like the majority. But this is the first time I've seen that logic applied to a non-halachic midrashic statement, so that's fascinating to me. Okay, so most other commentaries accept that this deal actually did happen, just that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't hold up his end of the bargain, which creates a different problem. How could Moshe go back on an oath? The Chidah actually brings this up in at least 3 different places that I saw, and gives different answers in each of them. I'm going to share 2 of them with you. In the first one, he uses the specific language used in the dialogue in the Midrash, and uses that to disqualify the oath. You may have noticed earlier when I first showed you the Midrash that the language was kind of weird. Yisro said that the first son would be dedicated to idolatry, and from here on, for the sake of heaven. That's what it says, Mikan ve'elach, from here on. So according to the Chidah, Yisro messed up. He said from here on the kids would be monotheists, which would imply that they would be monotheists from here on, from the moment they made that deal, before Moshe and Zipporah were even married, before they had any kids. So that would override the first part of the deal and mean that all of the kids they would have from then on, which is all of their kids, because they hadn't had any kids yet, would be raised as Jews. And then he concludes that if Yisro had said it right, and had said from then on, then Moshe Rabbeinu never would have agreed to it. So according to this, the language of the contract invalidated it, and Moshe was free to raise his kids however he wanted. But, according to another answer from the Chidah, Moshe Rabbeinu relied on a different loophole. He quotes a commentary on that Midrash that says that Moshe relied on the righteousness of his wife Zipporah. That commentary doesn't explain more than that, but the Chidah explains that that means that when their first son Gershom was born, Zipporah rose up in fury and said, "He doesn't have the right to make parental decisions like that for our child, only I do." And then the Chidah uses that verse that told us about Gershom's name to fill in some more of the gaps in the story. As we said earlier, the verse says, the name of one was Gershom because he said, "I was a stranger in a foreign land." The Chidah points out that the "because he said" part seems unnecessary. It should just say, his name was Gershom because I was a stranger in a foreign land. And that's how it does say it with Eliezer. The name of one was Eliezer because the God of my father was my help. So the Chidah says that Gershom wasn't named Gershom because his father was a ger, a stranger in a foreign land. He was named Gershom because his father said that he was a stranger in a foreign land. So he explains that when Gershom was born and Yisro demanded that Moshe fulfill his end of the bargain, and then Zipporah came and said, "No, Moshe doesn't have that power to make those decisions for our child, only I do," Moshe just backed off and said, "I'm a stranger here, what can I do? I didn't know that the law of the land here is that the mother is in charge." Okay, so first of all, according to this, Zipporah is the hero here, and she's the one who got them out of this whole thing. One thing that confuses me a little bit, though, is that if this was the way things worked in Midian, where Yisro himself lived, why wouldn't he have taken that into account when he made the deal? So one possible answer that I thought of is that maybe Yisro assumed that Moshe would follow his own customs with his family, which would underscore even more the importance of this statement that Gershom is named for, that I was a stranger in a foreign land. Basically saying, hey, this is out of my wheelhouse, I don't have any power here. So that would make sense. If anybody else has a better answer, let me know in the comments. Okay, so like I said, most commentaries agree that this deal was never actually implemented. But there are some places that say that it still had an impact. The Baal HaTurim references this deal and once again focuses on the bris aspect of it. He says that even though Moshe Rabbeinu got out of the deal, it still had an impact. And as a result, a guy named Yonasan descended from him who was a priest for the idol of Micha. Okay, so while I was digging around for breadcrumbs about this deal, this story about Yonasan and Micha kept on popping up. And I wasn't familiar with it, and it was confusing to me. So let me clear things up. First of all, the Yonasan that we're talking about here is not the Yonasan, the one that was best friends with David HaMelech, or King David. And the Micha that we're talking about here is not the prophet, the Navi Micha. These are just 2 random bad guys. This is a story in Shoftim, Judges, about some guy named Micha who made an idol that was worshipped by members of the tribe of Dan. And he hired some guy named Jonathan to be the priest for that idol. This is what it says there. The Danites set up the graven image for themselves, and Yonasan the son of Gershom the son of Manasseh and his descendants served as priests to the Danite tribe until the land went into exile. Now, if you look at the Hebrew, you'll notice that Yonasan's grandfather Manasseh, his name is written weird. There's a little nun floating up above the rest of the letters. And if you read that name Manasseh minus the nun, you get Moshe. And according to Rashi, who gets it from Gemara, that's exactly what it's supposed to mean. He says that it's written as Manasseh out of respect to Moshe Rabbeinu, but it really means Moshe. Which means that this Jonathan guy was Moshe Rabbeinu's grandson. He was the son of Gershom, the boy that the deal applied to. So even though according to every commentary that I could find, Gershom was never actually raised that way, many places say that it still had an effect, and this was the effect, that this Jonathan guy came from Moshe from Gershom. The Gemara adds another interesting aspect to this story. It says that people asked Jonathan, hey, how could you serve an idol? You're the grandson of Moshe Rabbeinu. And he answered that I actually learned this from the house of my grandfather, that one should always sell himself out to avodah zarah, to idolatry, rather than become dependent on the financial help of others. So that's pretty wild to say that he got this idea to serve idols from Moshe Rabbeinu. And the Gemara goes on and explains that Jonathan misunderstood this. That's not what Moshe Rabbeinu ever taught. What this saying must have meant was that you should do avodah zarah, which usually means idolatry, but literally just means strange service, and could be translated as weird jobs, meaning take whatever job you can find so that you're not financially dependent on charity. So the Gemara there doesn't connect any of this to the deal. It does connect it to Yisro, and Yisro having been an idol worshipper, but it doesn't connect it to this whole Gershom deal. And none of the commentaries on that Gemara did either. And even the places that did say that this whole Jonathan story happened because of the deal just said it generally and didn't connect it back to this Gemara and this whole thing with Jonathan saying that I learned it from the house of my grandfather. But to me, I was wondering if you could make that connection. If this teaching that Yonasan said he learned from the house of his grandfather was something that he learned in his idol worshiper training. So I dug and dug and dug, and I had a very hard time finding anything. But eventually I found one place that made the connection. It's in a book called Gvul Binyamin by Binyamin Vitali, who lived in Italy in the 1600s. I've never heard of him before, and usually I don't like to quote things unless I can get some type of context for who the person is, but it seems legit. He seems like a good guy. There doesn't seem to be any heresy here, so I'm going to quote it. He says that Yonasan got this idea that a person should sell themselves out to idolatry rather than depend on charity from the deal. And he paraphrases Yonasan's words like this: my grandfather made that deal so that he could live in Yisro's house and tend his sheep. So I'm just like him.
Who taught you how to do this stuff?
You, all right? I learned it by watching you.
So this doesn't suggest that Gershom ever actually received any idol worshipping training, but it's still a very interesting way of looking at this deal. That Moshe married Yisro's daughter so that he could have a job, and in order to do that, he needed to accept this idol worshipping deal. But of course, as the Gemara explains, Yonasan misunderstood this, and Moshe, of course, never intended to teach or model a lesson like that. Okay, so we're almost done, but there's one more question we still have to answer, which is, how could Yisro have made this deal? As I mentioned earlier, even though Yisro was a Midianite idolatry priest, he gave it up when he went to the desert and met up with all the Israelites after hearing about all the miracles that Hashem had done for them. He said, Ata Yadaiti, now I know that God is greater than all other gods. So it seems like Yisro switched to our team. And there's a midrash that gives us more details that makes this question even stronger. It says that if anyone else would have said this, now I know that God is greater than all other gods, then people would have been justified in making fun of that guy and saying, oh, this guy knows? But Yisro had actually served every single form of idolatry known to man, and gone through each one of them and found all of them to be empty, until he got to the one true God. Okay, so one possible answer could be that Yisro just hadn't gotten to that point yet when he made the deal. The whole Ata Yadaiti, now I know thing only happened later, when he brought Moshe's family, including those two boys, to the desert, which obviously means that they were already born. That whole story happens much later. So you could say that back when he made the deal, he was still worshipping idols. But in another midrash, it says that when Moshe first met Zipporah, and she and her sisters were out in the field tending her father's sheep, the whole reason why they were out there working was because Yisro had quit being the priest of idolatry. And everybody got mad at him and canceled him, basically, and said nobody is allowed to work for him. So he couldn't get anybody else to tend his sheep, and that's why his daughters were out there doing the work for him. So according to this, Yisro at least started his journey of rejecting idolatry before Moshe and Zipporah even met. So the question still stands. Why would Yisro have demanded that his daughter and son-in-law raise their first son as an idol worshiper if he himself was already at least questioning it? So the Chidush HaRim answers this question. This is actually something that I saw years ago, and it's how I even knew about this midrash in the first place. And it stuck with me when I first saw it, and I think about it all the time. He explains that Yisro didn't want Gershom to be an idol worshiper. He wanted Gershom to believe in God, the God of the Hebrews. But the way he wanted Gershom to get there was the same way that he did, by personally experiencing every single other option and finding all of them to be empty. But he says Moshe Rabbeinu disagreed with this approach and knew that there was no way to do this without leaving some kind of residual effect. And he says it's like somebody who spits and gets a little bit of spittle on themselves. So basically, Yisro and Moshe had opposing educational philosophies. Yisro believed that children need to experience everything for themselves in order to eventually get to the truth. And Moshe Rabbeinu believed that that presents too high of a risk.
Yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
That just going through that process, even if it ultimately does work, will do lasting damage along the way. So like I said, I think about this a lot, and for many years, ever since I first saw it, I kind of liked Yisro's style better. You can probably tell from watching these videos, even if this is the first one you've seen, that I'm a big fan of discovery and exploration. So I was really drawn to this idea of this open sandbox approach to finding Hashem, as opposed to what could be perceived as a more restrictive and prescriptive approach. But as I was working on this rabbit hole, I realized Yisro's approach might be different than I was originally looking at it. Yisro's approach, according to the Chidush HaRim, as I understand it, was to engage with ideas that he himself had already decided were wrong and dangerous, solely for the purpose of debunking them. And what I realized was that that's not really my thing. My thing is exploring things that are fun and delightful and interesting and whimsical. And Moshe Rabbeinu's approach, which is Torah, has an infinite amount of all of that stuff for me to explore. Alright, that's it. That's the rabbit hole. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel. Thank you for following me down the rabbit hole. Let's make a deal. One of us gets to leave the rabbit hole, and the other one has to stay down here for all eternity. Deal?